Well, good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. So if you have not already done so, please find something to eat. We have some finger foods or something to drink. We have some cold drinks, and help yourself to that. Also, first I want to welcome you. Welcome. Glad that everyone is here. We are recording the lecture this evening, and if you were not here last week, the first lecture is recorded, and it's available on our YouTube page, so we encourage you to take a look at it. You can go back, and even if you were here, listen to it again and take notes. We covered a lot of information spanning from roughly 2500 BC all the way up until 1780, 1790. So that's a pretty large period of time, and then tonight we're also recording, so if you miss anything, don't worry too much about feverishly taking notes, because it is available on YouTube. Will be available on YouTube by the end of the week or the first of next week, so you can go back and review it. Welcome. If you are new here, my name is Greg Bainey. I'm the pastor of Woodlands Gathering, and it's our vision as a church to be a safe place where Native Americans and all people can encounter the good news of God. And so we're glad that you're joining us this evening. If you need to use the restroom at any point, go back in the foyer and go down the steps, and to the left-hand side downstairs are the men's and women's restrooms. So encourage you just to no, thank you. Just to make use of those if you need to. Okay, if you cannot see, and the lights are a little dimmer this evening, but can everyone see that? Clifford, can you see that in the back where you are? Can you see the presentation here? But can you see the presentation? You can see it? Okay, good. All right. Well, before we begin, let me say a word of prayer. I may be standing in your way over there, but if I am, just let me know, and I'll try to step to the side. All right, let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you, our God, for this evening. We thank you for the chance we have to be able to come together and to learn. And we know that sometimes the things we learn can be unsettling and uncomfortable. We pray that you would help us to push through it and to think deeply and prayerfully about what we'll discuss this evening. Thank you for all those who are here and all those who might join us via YouTube later whenever this recording is published. And we just ask, oh God, that you would take this information and help us not to be overwhelmed with sorrow or perhaps with remorse, but rather to think productively about how we can move forward and how we can join you and your Holy Spirit in the work of reparative justice. So, Father, we thank you for all those who are interested this evening, and just ask for your wisdom and your guidance and your peace to be in all of our hearts. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, this is our second of a three-part lecture series entitled We Are Still Here, an Indigenous History of the United States. And if you are curious as to who I am, my name is Greg Bainey. I'm a pastor here, but I'm also from a mixed ancestry. I come from both a settler ancestry as well as Cherokee and Choctaw, so native ancestry. And these are topics that we'll discuss tonight and explore together that I have been exploring and learning and interacting with for the better part of my life. And these are things that chances are you've never heard before, or if you have, probably not in a traditional school setting. So I just encourage you to bear with me and to be patient. Perhaps some of the things you hear tonight are going to be hard to hear, and I think that's as a pastor, as a follower of Jesus, I think that's part of being faithful to the call of the gospel, is that we pursue truth even when it takes us into some uncomfortable territory. And then also to ask the question, well, what does this mean for me? You know, part of this lecture series, part of our purpose in this lecture series is to help us all develop a robust theology of place. And any issues, son? Okay. A robust theology of place. And so that theology of place requires us to ask the question, how did I get here? And who was here before I was? and what is my responsibility both to the past as well as to the present, to the host peoples as well as to people who currently occupy this space together. And so just to give you some idea of where we came from as well as what we'll talk about tonight and where we're going next week. Next Wednesday is our third and final lecture. And also to give you kind of a lay of the land, I'll lecture from roughly now, which is 6:15 until 7:15, and then we'll have a brief 3 to 5 minute break and then transition to a time of discussion. So if you do have any questions, and I hope you do, be thinking of questions, and then you can save those and ask them during the discussion period. Last Wednesday, we covered from Cahokia to colonization. So we saw the expansive impact that indigenous people made on the North American continent prior to 1492. And then we followed some ideological and theological frameworks and the impact of those frameworks on settler expansion from 1492 onwards until the beginning of the American Republic in the late 18th century. Tonight, we're going to talk about attempted annihilation and assimilation. This generally, when we've done this in the past, last year we did a 2-part lecture series due to the calendar. We weren't able to make it 3 weeks, so we condensed some information. But the prior 2 years, we actually kept with tradition and did a 3-part lecture series. And the second lecture, which is what you're here for tonight, is always the most difficult because I think, some of the ideologies, and whenever we think about a theology of place and developing a theology of place and understanding why it's important to have one, we begin to grasp and appreciate the importance of it as we look at history. And we see how that certain ideologies and even theologies are lived out in a way that even if the people who implemented those ideas were well-meaning, they still had some very serious ramifications, even deadly ramifications for others. So we're going to learn tonight the importance of where our thoughts and our ideas take us. And we're going to see from history some very real-world examples. And we're going to journey through this together. I encourage you to stick with me. I know it's not going to be easy, but I promise you that next week, come back for the best part next week when we talk about from ashes to resurgence and also reparative justice. And that's next week's lecture, week 3, from ashes to resurgence, the role of reparative justice. And if you've not heard of that term, that's okay. We're going to introduce it to you really in full next week and talk in depth about what it means, what it doesn't mean, and also how it is entwined with our vision here at Woodlands Gathering to be a safe place for Native people and all people to encounter the good news of God. So that's a brief look back as well as an outline of where we're heading. So what is the objective of this series? Well, this series seeks to explore the history of the United States' relationship with indigenous peoples in general and the specific role of Euro-Christian settlers in particular. Now, the very term Euro-Christian may be a new term for you. It's a catch-all, basically, a phrase that is used to identify anyone from the European mainland who comes and settles in what was at the time referred to as the New World. And as we have seen already and we'll explore tonight, the way that Christianity, not the true gospel, not the true teachings of Christ, but the way that, to some extent, a misunderstanding of those teachings and westernized Christianity has sort of become co-opted in the past and used to justify some of the actions of the past. So we'll explore the relationship with indigenous peoples in general and the specific role of the Euro-Christian settlers in particular. The objective is to encourage steps towards reparative justice through understanding. So I know it may be difficult to journey together tonight, but I encourage us to stick together because we believe that as we seek to understand, reparative justice can truly begin to take place, and the gospel will illuminate our hearts and show us all the way forward. Okay, so if you were here last week, you are familiar with some of this information, but I'll just start with a quote by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who is an author of a book similarly titled to this lecture series. She wrote a book entitled An Indigenous People's Perspective of the United States, and she says this in that book. She says, "Under the crust of that portion of earth called the United States of America, from California to the Gulf Stream waters, are interred the bones, villages, fields, and sacred objects of American Indians. They cry out for their stories to be heard through their descendants, who carry the memories of how the country was founded and how it came to be as it is today. I'm letting the cat out of the bag a little bit in that down at the bottom I give some numbers that we introduced last week, but the conservative estimate is that in North America, prior to 1492, there were anywhere between 60 and 100 million people who resided on the North American continent alone. Now, that's what is currently the United States. That's excluding Canada and Central and South America. So 60 to 100 million people. By 1650, there were 10 million estimated people. And these are indigenous people. By the 1890s, roughly 250,000. The most recent census in 2020 showed that there were 9.7 million people who identify as Native America currently alive today, so there definitely is a resurgence. But it also means that the majority of an entire people group lives with trauma. Lives with historical trauma. And so we're going to explore how we go from the conservative estimate of 60 million people in 1492 down to 250,000 in 1890. So we're not going to cover too much of the material. In fact, I'll just briefly reiterate a couple things I said last week. Mainly, there are coming out of the age of colonization, there are two concepts. One is the doctrine of discovery. And yes, it was a theological doctrine because it was sanctioned at the time by the only existing church in the West, which was the Roman Catholic Church in the 15th century. This is prior to the Protestant Reformation. And in the West, the Pope sort of reigned supreme over Christianity. And so what we're about to explore, what we've already seen, the justification for colonization, was made on a theological basis by the doctrine of discovery, which in essence stated that any non-Christian people or landmass could and should be conquered in the name of the church and in the crown of Europe by those who are Christian. And so this, of course, was one thing that compelled King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to commission the journey of Christopher Columbus in the 1490s. And later, during the period of colonization, the doctrine of discovery was sort of evolved or devolved, if you will, into something known as American covenantalism, an ideological belief in the exceptionalism of America. One that is justified theologically, that is justified ideologically, that basically says that America has a unique role to play in the nations of the world. And if you listen to a lot of the ministers at the time who referred to the 13 colonies at least, they referred to the colonies in the same language that Christ referred to his church. Many ministers, and we read excerpts last week of Puritans such as William Bradford and others, Cotton Mather and others, who said that the 13 colonies were intended to be a city on a hill, the salt of the earth. So language that is explicitly used in the Gospels for Christ and his church is being co-opted and used for a nation, especially for the early American experiment. So that laid the groundwork. Both the doctrine of discovery theologically and American covenantalism ideologically laid the groundwork for what we call the Age of Annihilation. Because, after all, if the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard correspond to the 13 tribes of Israel, 12 plus Levi, then the inhabitants of the land must be driven out. And so part of the myth, part of the narrative that began to be embodied in the history that was shared in this country assumed that Americans, mainly Anglo-Americans, had the right to the land because it was given to them by God. And therefore, the Age of Annihilation, what Helen Hunt in her book, A Generation of Dishonor. She wrote this book at the end of the 1800s. She referred to this entire period, beginning in the early 19th century and culminating in 1890, as the generation of dishonor. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the founder of, or I should say, one of the leading advocates of the modern civil rights movement, said this. He said, "Our nation was born in genocide. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. We'll talk about this later on. Indeed, even today, this was in the 1960s, and I would argue it remains true today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. So let's look at the period briefly between 1820 and 1890. Last week we spoke of the Proclamation Line of 1763, which was delineated by King George. It was actually one of the reasons that the early colonists rebelled against the king, one of the many reasons. And the Proclamation Line of 1763 basically said that there would be a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains. Later it moved a little west to the Blue Ridge Mountains under the Holston Treaty. But prior to the American Revolution, this line was drawn by King George along the Appalachian Mountains, and he said, this will be the boundary of our expansion. We will not, as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, move beyond this point. And so from that point, the early colonists said, well, King George is trying to limit our expansion. And so that was one of the grievances that was actually mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. We quoted it last week. So what happened in that period after the American Revolution, after the United States, newly minted United States, declared its independence and won its independence from Great Britain? Was it a time of peace and tranquility? No, unfortunately. Rather, it was the age of the land speculator, and we introduced this last week as well. An entire business model that was predicated on speculating on native-owned land. And we gave the example last week that if you were here, you recall of how that they would bargain with local native tribes, and usually those native tribes were not fully aware of what was even being discussed, sometimes because of the notion of private land ownership being such a ridiculous or novel concept to many of the native people. They simply assumed that the settlers were purchasing either farming rights or hunting rights. And so they would agree upon a certain plot of land, and then the speculators would go back, generally with the use of a good surveyor, have a much larger piece of land drawn up, and then encourage the landed gentry, the elites along the eastern seaboard, to invest in that land. Well, many of the landed gentry, the elites, became representatives of Congress in the newly minted American Republic. In fact, our first president was a former land surveyor, meaning that he worked with and for some of these land speculating companies. And so by the point that we had a Continental Army, we had teeth in order to implement the successful, to oversee the successful return on the investment. So between 1814 and 1824, 75% of what is now Alabama and Florida, along with 33% of Tennessee and 20% of Georgia, became the private property of white settlers. All this land was seized from indigenous tribes in violation of treaties that were set forth by the federal government, such as the Treaty of Holston that we explored last week with the Cherokee Nation. The settlers became known as settler squatters, people such as John Sevier. And obtained heroic status through the glamorization of those efforts through popular literature, such as James Fenimore Cooper and others during that time. So last week we talked about the Treaty of Holston, which was initiated between the U.S. government and the Cherokee people in 1791. It was a response to John Sevier and his newly named state of Franklin, which would later become part of western Tennessee. And John Sevier, in essence, expanded into Tennessee beyond the treaty boundary of 1791. The treaty boundary of 1791 said that the Blue Ridge Mountains would be the western boundary of the United States. John Sevier disregarded that, went beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains to set up the state of Franklin. When the native people were displeased, he retaliated and actually killed several and burnt their villages to the ground. And so the Treaty of Holston was initiated between the U.S. government and the Cherokee people to try to rectify the situation. And as a result of that treaty, the Cherokee people gave up what was then known as the state of Franklin. and also agreed to pursue civilization. This was one of the actual agreements between the Cherokee people and the U.S. government per the Treaty of Holston in 1791, to pursue civilization as defined by Euro-Christian settlers. And then in 1827, the way that they did so was the Cherokee actually formed a nation. Prior to that, if you were here last week, you know that the term sovereignty was not a term that indigenous people in North America used prior to 1492. The notion that this country was a nation, really didn't exist, because in order to be a nation, you have to have either a king who's a sovereign or the people who are sovereign. And in the case of many of the indigenous tribes, the community was autonomous. The community may elect leaders, but the leaders really operated at the will of the clan mothers or the clan fathers, and the notion of superiority and sovereignty and therefore nationhood simply did not exist. But in 1827, the Cherokee people said, well, at that point also there was significant intermarriage between many of the Cherokee people and the white settlers, so they said, let's adopt the white form of government. Let's create a constitution based on the U.S. Constitution. And so they did so. And that gave birth to the period of John Ross. John Ross, if you know of him, as well as, actually Ross's Landing here in Chattanooga is named for John Ross. He was the chief of the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation at the time of removal. And he believed up until the very last that he would be able to appeal to the U.S. government on the basis of law as to why the Cherokee people in particular had a legal right to the land. This is Chief Wilma Mankiller. She was the first principal chief of the Cherokee Nation back in the 1980s, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. And she said this. She said, the fledgling United States government's method of dealing with Native people, a process which then included systematic genocide, property theft, and total subjugation, reached its nadir in 1830 under the federal policy of President Andrew Jackson. More than any other president, he used forcible removal to expel the eastern tribes from their land. From the very birth of the nation, the United States government truly had carried out a vigorous operation of extermination and removal. Decades before Jackson took office, during the administration of Thomas Jefferson, it was already cruelly apparent to many Native American leaders, and this is true, and I'll explain in a moment, that any hope for tribal autonomy was cursed. So were any thoughts of peaceful coexistence with white citizens. Pursuant to the 1791 Holston Treaty, there was a faction within the Cherokee Nation known as the Chickamauga Cherokee. And they actually broke apart from the Cherokee Nation when the Cherokee Nation pursued nationhood and adopted its constitution in 1827. The Chickamauga Cherokee, many, moved west of the Mississippi River. And what were originally known as the Western Cherokee people, the Western Cherokee Nation, the Western Cherokee of Arkansas, what is now Arkansas and Missouri, were what they call the early settlers, people who moved west of the Mississippi prior to the Trail of Tears because they saw that it would not be possible to coexist with white citizens. Now, at the time, those who remained behind, due to the loyalty of the graves of their father, the fact that Cherokee people had lived in the Southeast, the state of Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, and Kentucky for more than 3,000 years, they were unwilling, and they thought, surely, now that we're becoming civilized, surely we can argue in the court of law for the rights of our land, and we will not have to flee. It was during the 1820s, again, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, the beginning of what is known as the era of Jacksonian democracy. And if you have studied American history, you're familiar with that term. The era of Jacksonian settler democracy, that the unique U.S. origin myth evolved, reconciling rhetoric with reality. What was previously part of a mythical narrative, part of the belief of the doctrine of discovery and American covenantalism, actually became reality when, under Andrew Jackson, legalized forced removal of an entire people group, not just one, but 5 nations, occurred. As the Cherokee Nation were in the process of ratifying their constitution and forming a nation, they had some disagreements with the what would later become the state of Georgia, because the state of Georgia said, well, we are pursuing statehood, and as a state, we have the right over our sovereign boundaries. The Cherokee Nation said, no, you don't. We have lived on this land for 3,000 years. The right is ours. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In an 1823, in the landmark case, Johnson versus McIntosh, the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall made this decision. He declared that Indians could occupy and control lands within the United States, but could not hold title to those lands. The justification, quote, when it declared independence from the Crown, the United States government inherited the right of preemption over Native American lands. The legal result is that the only Native American conveyance of land which can create valid title are sales of land to the federal government. In other words, the only way that a Native American land could become validated, title or entitlement to that land could become valid, is if they sold that land to the U.S. government. Now, if you think this law antiquated, let me say that in 2013, there was a court case with the Oneida Nation versus the state of North of New York, and the then liberal Ginsburg, court justice, actually voted against the Oneida Nation. And believe it or not, she quoted John Marshall, and she quoted the doctrine of discovery. And she appealed to the fact that Native Americans had right of occupancy in this land, but not right of ownership. And you say, wait a minute, how can someone who's lived on the land for 3,000 years, whose creation stories have them originating with the land, have right of occupancy but not right of ownership? Well, you have to go back to the doctrine of discovery. They were not Christian. They were not European. And therefore, since they were not European and they were not Christian, the right of the land could not possibly legally be theirs. Well, something happened. Unfortunately, the Cherokee Nation in 1827 ratified their constitution, and they said, look, we are a nation now similar to the United States. Many of them began dressing like their white settler neighbors, intermarrying with their white settler neighbors, even having slaves, unfortunately, with their white settler neighbors. And then in 1829, Andrew Jackson, the famed Indian fighter who fought along the Muskogee, the Creek Nation in the Red Sticks War, was elected president of the United States. By the way, when you go to a powwow, no Indian, no Native person will accept a $20 bill. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. When Andrew Jackson gave his first address to Congress, his first annual address, he actually, and I don't have time to tell you to read the address verbatim, you can look it up on the Presidential Library, but he actually talks about the Indian problem. And he makes reference to the fact that even though the Cherokee Nation has adopted a constitution and attempted, in his words, to become civilized, they will never do so. And so after hearing that, the state of Georgia becomes emboldened, and they want to take the court case back to the Supreme Court and argue that they have the right to usurp authority over the Cherokee Nation. Well, Georgia tried to claim most of the Cherokee Nation's territory as public land, resolving that the Cherokee Nation's constitution was null and void. The Cherokee Nation appealed again to the Supreme Court, with Chief John Marshall writing for the majority, meaning that Chief John Marshall voted in favor of the Cherokee Nation, the same guy who said that Native people do not have right of ownership, but they do have right of occupancy. He saw the legitimacy of their constitution and said, they're correct. The Cherokee Nation is not subjugated to the state of Georgia. However, between the writing of that majority opinion and the execution of it, gold was discovered in Georgia. And so overnight, 40,000 gold seekers flooded into the state, rushing into lands that were previously part of the Cherokee Nation, causing the state of Georgia, with the support of the president, to ignore the Supreme Court's ruling. And those of you who know history, you know that when Andrew Jackson became president and he chose to ignore the Supreme Court's ruling, John Marshall said, "You are in violation of the Constitution and therefore at risk of being impeached." And Andrew Jackson's reply was, "I have an army, you don't." So that led to the writing and the implementation of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This law authorized the president to negotiate with the southern and mid-Atlantic Native American tribes for their removal to federal territory west of the Mississippi River in exchange for white settlement of their ancestral lands. The act was signed by Andrew Jackson, and it was strongly enforced under his administration and that of Martin Van Buren, culminating and ending officially in 1841. By the year 1839, all Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Muskogee or Creek who did not remove, this is what the Indian Removal Act declared, to lands west of the Mississippi in what was then known as Indian Territory, it's since become known as the state of Oklahoma, voluntarily would be rounded up and forcibly removed by gunpoint. And of course, most people know the story of the Trail of Tears. You know that's exactly what happened. This journey west would prove extremely costly, with more than 5,000 Cherokee alone dying from exposure and sickness along the way. So great was the loss and longing for the land of their ancestors that the journey became known as the Trail of Tears. An anonymous Cherokee writing in Niles Weekly in 1830 said this: "We have been called a poor, ignorant, and degraded people. We certainly are not rich, nor have we ever boasted of our knowledge or our moral or intellectual elevation. But there is not a man within our limits so ignorant as to not know that he has a right to live on the land of his fathers. Nor is there a man so degraded as not to feel a keen sense of injury on being deprived of his right and driven into exile." So how do you justify this? Well, it didn't take long. What was previously coined as the doctrine of discovery, relabeled as American covenantalism, in the 19th century was rebranded as manifest destiny. And this is a popular painting from that era, and as I said last week, a picture says 1,000 words. A people dream through their art, and I apologize for the poor quality of this painting. I've been looking at my computer all this time. But what you can vaguely make out there is that Lady Columbia, who represents the exceptional destiny of the American peoples, is moving westward. And in her wake is the Indian. Also in her wake is, or I should say in her wake is the railroad. They're coming, the stagecoach, the railroad, the farmers, the progress. And then she's driving out, and you can't really tell in this because of the lighting, but this is dark over here, and everywhere that Lady Columbia is light. And as she moves west, of course, the buffalo are running away, and the Plains tribes are running away, and in their wake is farms and fields and progress. On December the 27th, 1845, 4 years after the official end of the Indian Removal Act. By the way, anyone ever been to Washington, D.C. in the Capitol Rotunda and look up at the art on the walls? One of the most beautiful paintings, but also the most disturbing, was commissioned roughly in 1841, 1842. The painting of the baptism of Pocahontas. Now, why do you think in the American psyche it would be important right after the Indian Removal Act to paint a portrait on the holy temple of our country's government of the baptism of Pocahontas? To show a psyche, a psychological affirmation that, see, we did good. On December the 27th, 1845, John O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant, wrote in the New York Morning News the following concerning the right of the U.S. to claim lands west of the Mississippi. Did not end with the Blue Ridge Mountains, did not end with the state of Georgia, with the state of Tennessee. And so he writes this. He says, "The claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence," tying in American exceptionalism, American covenantalism, the doctrine of discovery, sanctioned by God, Providence with a capital P, has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. Officially coining the phrase manifest destiny. According to the historian Robert Miller, there were three aspects of the ideology of manifest destiny: the special virtues of the American people and their institutions, the mission of the United States to redeem and remake the West into the image of the agrarian East. In fact, you see this also played out in the mission of the church, unfortunately. Many of the missionaries who, during this period of time, began working with native tribes, very few of them actually saw many converts. But what they considered to be a mark of success is that when they ended their work, what were formerly a nomadic people were trying to farm the land, were building houses instead of living in teepees, and were working the soil the way they were. So this idea that the mission of the United States to redeem and remake the West in the image of the agrarian East became reality. And then third, an irresistible destiny to accomplish this essential duty. This was not a new idea. Remember what Chief Mankiller said? This was not a new idea, but one that awaited westward lust, born in the infancy of the American Republic to come of age. In 1811, John Adams stated this. He said, "The whole continent of North America." This is 1811. Right before the War of 1812, right, within a few years of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams says, "The whole continent of North America appears to be destined by whom? Divine providence, to be peopled by one nation, speaking one language, professing one general system of religious and political principles, and accustomed to one general tenor of social usages and customs, for the common happiness of them all, for their peace and prosperity. I believe it is indispensable that they should be associated in one federal union." So how did this play out? The picture disappeared. How did this play out in everyday life? Well, with many of the southeastern tribes having been conquered and moved west of the Mississippi, the U.S. began to, with their military power that was emboldened by recently winning the Civil War, they turned their attention to the Great Plains tribes. And one man in particular who breaks my heart was one of the generals, the colonels, in charge of what later became known as the Indian Wars, was a former Methodist minister. And this is what he had to say, Colonel John Chivington. He said, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice." So what were his actions? Well, they spoke louder than his words. 1851, the Fort Laramie Treaty guaranteed land in Colorado that it would remain under Cheyenne and Arapaho ownership. But, as happened in Georgia, gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains. So by 1861, merely 10 years later, tension between the new settlers and the Cheyenne were rising. You heard of the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers. These were people who had a mission to, protect their hunting grounds and to drive out many of the white settlers. The same year, Cheyenne, under the leadership of Black Kettle, ceded most of their land in return for a 600 square mile reservation under the Treaty of Fort Wise. In 1864, John Evans, governor of the territory, invited friendly Indians such as Black Kettle to camp near the fort. Black Kettle moved his band near Fort Lyon, Colorado, but our good friend Colonel Shivington moved his troops to the plains, and on November the 29th slaughtered 148 Cheyenne, most of whom were women, children, and old elderly. Black Kettle escaped, but he was later killed by Custer at the Washita massacre. One of the soldiers who served under Shivington later gave a testimony in Congress, John S. Smith, in 1865, and this was his testimony. Now, this was a soldier, by the way, who had fought in the Civil War. He was a veteran of the Civil War. And he said, "I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than ever I saw before. The women cut all to pieces with knives, scalped, their brains knocked out, children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there, from sucking infants up to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the U.S. troops." One of the emblems, and I want you to picture this in your mind and to remember this picture, because at the time, this particular mountain range, known as the Six Grandfathers in the Black Hills of South Dakota, sacred land to the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota, was something that they were never willing to give up. In fact, even to this day, in the late 1870s, the U.S. government offered, because gold was found in them there hills, in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the U.S. government offered $1 million to the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota people, and they said no. Why? Because these six grandfathers, these mountains, were the equivalent to the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. I want you to remember that. The Indian Wars continued, and Sitting Bull, the great Lakota medicine leader or medicine man and leader, said, "There are things they tell us that sound good to hear, but when they have accomplished their purpose, they will go home and will not try to fulfill our agreements with them." One of the triumphs on the side of the American Indians at the time is the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Custer, his 7th Cavalry, Custer rose to stardom during the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, he became a renowned Indian fighter, actually respected among Native people up to this point in time, because he was brave. He was considered to be a very brave leader. His 7th, and by the way, next week we'll talk about resurgence, from ashes to resurgence. And one of the characteristics of the period of the 1970s is, and you may have heard of Vine Deloria Jr. Vine Deloria Jr. was the intellectual arm of the American Indian movement of the 1970s. And he wrote a book entitled "Custer Died for Your Sins." And in that book, he makes an American Indian Manifesto in which he said the Battle of the Little Bighorn did not have to happen. In fact, the Cheyenne, the Lakota, the Blackfeet warriors who were gathered on the banks of the Greasy Grass, or what was known by many of the settlers as the Little Bighorn, were living peacefully. They had left the reservation, yes, to hunt buffalo, because the cattle promised to them by the U.S. government never arrived. So as Custer's 7th Army had been called in to a reconnaissance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet warriors, a small group of Native Americans were spied by Custer's army, supposedly sniffing out his trail. Custer divided his men into 3 battalions and prepared for an engagement. The Native warriors, under the leadership of Crazy Horse, White Bull, and Chief Gaul, attacked Custer and defeated him and his troops. However, that victory for the Native people was short-lived, and in the winter of 1877 and the summer of 1878, they were terrible seasons for the Cheyenne. Their fall hunt had proved unsuccessful. Why? Because many of the buffalo had been killed. In fact, it was part of the U.S. government's policy, American Indian policy at the time, to commission buffalo hunters to kill as many buffaloes as possible. Why? Because the buffalo for the Plains tribes was their #1 source of subsistence. And if there's one way to conquer an enemy, it's through hunger. Their fall hunt had proven unsuccessful. Indians from other reservations had hunted the ground over before them and driven the buffalo off. And the Cheyennes made their way home again in straggling parties, destitute and hungry. Their agent reported that the result of this hunt had clearly proved that in the future the Indian must rely on tilling the ground as their principal means of support. And if this conviction can be firmly established, the greatest obstacle to the advancement in agriculture will be overcome. With the buffalo gone and their pony herds being constantly decimated by the inroads of horse thieves, they must soon adopt in all its varieties the way of the white man. It's Helen Hunt Jackson in her book, A Century of Dishonor. The culmination, and you might say the climax and the conclusion of the American Indian War, the war of the U.S. government against the Plains tribes, was 1890, it was initially known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. Thankfully, it was changed after some appeal on the descendants of those who were there to the Wounded Knee Massacre, because in all reality, that's what it was. What was the Wounded Knee Massacre? Well, there was a group of Cheyenne and Lakota that had Oglala, Lakota, and Dakota who had gathered at a winter hunting ground in order to try to survive the long winter. And the story is told, and by the way, warriors that were purportedly present were afterward determined not to be there. Mainly it was a camp of the elderly, women, and children. And there was a skirmish between one of the armies, one of the cavalries that were sent to, one of the cavalry. And think about it for a moment. I think history is never as straightforward as what we would like to think. But if you were the cavalry that was pursuing the Lakota, the Nakota, and the Dakota, and you heard about the 7th Cavalry and the decimation of Custer and his men, you'd probably be set on edge as well. So I'm sure that the infantry people and the cavalrymen who were surrounding this encampment were a little nervous about what the outcome might be. However, it was led by Colonel Shivington, and under his leadership, he forced the tents to be searched and all guns to be taken from those who were on site. There was purportedly a man who was deaf, and as he wrestled to try to have his gun kept with him, the gun went off. And as the gun went off, at the time there were some of the howitzer guns that had recently been used in the Civil War. They were pointed down into a ravine, and the men that were up on top of the hill, they thought, oh no, the Indians are attacking, let's take cover. And as they took cover, they began shooting into the ravine, and they shot. And this is the story of American Horse, who was there at the site. He was a Lakota chief, lived from 1840 to 1908. Afterward, he described the massacre. He said, there was a woman with an infant in her arms who was killed as she almost touched the flag of truce. A mother was shot down with her infant. The child, not knowing that its mother was dead, was still nursing. The women, as they were fleeing with their babies, were killed together, shot right through. And almost all of them had been killed. A cry was made that all those who were not killed or wounded should come forth, and they would be safe. Little boys came out of their places of refuge, and as soon as they came in sight, a number of soldiers surrounded them and butchered them there. This officially ended what is known as the American Indian Wars. An author whom most of you have probably heard of, named Black Elk. He was a Lakota soldier who was there that day. He had fled north. He was not part of that encampment, but he later came shortly after the massacre. And he said this. He said, I did not know then how much was ended. When I look back now from this high hill of my old age, I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all around. The crooked gulch as plain as when I saw them with eyes still young. And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there, and it was a beautiful dream. This is what became of the 6 grandfathers. The triumph of American exceptionalism, the last trophy of having conquered from sea to shining sea, the native peoples of North America. Okay, let's transition to the age of assimilation. We have now reached 1890, And if you remember our statistics, the American Indian population is roughly 250,000. After years and centuries of brutality, centuries of plague, centuries of death, we officially begin the period known as assimilation, roughly from 1890 to 1930. By the way, this picture is of a young man who was taken to the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He arrived looking as he does there on the left, and by the time he left, he looked as he does there on the right. And so they triumphed. They said, look, it is successful. What we now know, and we'll talk about this in greater detail next week, is that the majority, or a good number at least, of those who were taken to these boarding schools never came home. So what became of the land? Well, placing tribal land into trust under the Department of the Interior, under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, became the means of dealing with the land. Placing tribal land in trust is a process whereby the Secretary of the Department of the Interior acquires title. Now remember what John Marshall said? Only the U.S. government can hold title to Indian lands. So the Department of the Interior acquires title to property and holds it for the benefit of a Native American tribe or individual tribal members. Did you know that there's not one reservation in this country that is owned by a Native American? It is held in trust. And guess what? The one who holds it in trust can tell you if you get to keep it or not. Proof of that is the Mashpee Nation in 2015, when they lost their federal designation, and therefore the lands that were held in trust disappeared. And they had to go to the Supreme Court, and under the then president, unfortunately, they didn't get them back. They didn't get them back until the current administration. Between 1887 and 1934, the federal government took nearly 2/3 of reservation lands from the tribes without compensation. Zero compensation. The trust process was subsequently created as a tool to help tribes regain original land bases. The use of trust lands is governed by the tribes, subject to certain federal restrictions, and the land is usually not subject to state laws. That description, by the way, comes from the National Center for Tribal Government. That's a description from their website of what it means for a land to be held in trust. So, by 1900, this is what Indian lands looked like. The doctrine of discovery, American covenantalism, manifest destiny, strong ideologies justified by divine providence was successful. Senator Henry Dawes, who's famous because of the Dawes Commission, said this. He said, the defect of the reservation system was apparent. It is socialist, Henry George's system. And under that, there is no enterprise to make your home any better than that of your neighbor. Why would he say this? If you were here last week, remember what the native values were? You don't own the land. All land is held in common with your community. You don't live on the land, you live with the land. The notion of private property was the last vestige of native identity that was ultimately attempted assimilation under the newly minted Bureau of Indian Affairs. So Henry Dawes said there is no selfishness in the reservation system. They hold the land in common. A man doesn't have his own 40 acres and mule. Therefore, he can't be motivated by selfishness. Selfishness, said Henry Dawes, is at the bottom of civilization. Till this people will consent to give up their lands and divide among their citizens so that each can own the land that he cultivates, they will not make much more progress. He went on to say that until this people stop speaking in we and speaks in I, they will never be civilized. I don't know about y'all, but in the New Testament, I challenge you, those of you who, and if you don't know Greek, you can pull a blue letter Bible. Most of the time, when Paul is speaking to the church, it's you in the plural, not you in the singular. So what happened to the Indian Territory, the place where the 5 nations were taken? Well, here's its boundaries in 1855. You can see the Cherokee Nation in the upper northeast part, the Cherokee Outlet, the Creek Nation or Muskogee Nation in the center, the Choctaw Nation, Chickasaw Nation, and then a district that was leased to cattle farmers. So this was, and would later become the state of Oklahoma, this was Indian Territory. Senator Henry Dawes created a commission. An act of Congress was approved on March the 3rd of 1893. This established a commission to negotiate agreements with the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee Indian tribes. The commission's mission was to divide tribal land into plots, which were then divided among the members of the tribe. Due to the nature of the lands in Indian Territory and the dry climate, the 160-acre allotments were often too small to permit profitable farming, and many Indian families had to give up and lost their lands in future years. You ever been to Oklahoma? I used to live there. It's good for cattle. Parts of it are good for crops, but not most. Many tribal members resisted the allotment because it was antithetical to what it meant to be indigenous, the notion that you personally would be given the land. Some wealthy whites purchased membership. When Senator Dawes hired people and sent them to Oklahoma, they were told, you have to sign up so many native people per day. And if you don't, just bring in anyone. And so there were certain white settlers who purchased membership in these tribes and became pay-to-play Indians. They gave the commissioner $5, and they were included on the Dawes allotment rolls. The Curtis Act of 1898, the Act for the Protection of the People of Indian Territory, served to abolish tribal governments altogether, required the registration of all tribal members, and the surplus lands that were not allotted would be available for sale, opening up the state of Oklahoma. So these notices ran in the paper. Indian land for sale. Get a home of your own. Easy payments. Perfect title, possession within 30 days, fine lands in the west, irrigated, irrigable, grazing, agricultural, dry farming. Land that had been promised to the native people, but because the native people were unwilling to become selfish, it was taken from them and sold to the highest bidder. That's what happened to the land. Well, what happened to the people? Well, there was a chair of an organization known as the Friends of the Indians. The American Indian boarding school movement officially began under his leadership. He was the former supervisor of Indian prisoners at Fort Marion in Florida. If you've ever been there, you know that's where Geronimo was held. It's where several people, after the end of the American Indian Wars out west, were taken there as prisoners. And from there, a few of them were taken to Carlisle, the Indian school in Pennsylvania. He believed in full assimilation, and he coined a phrase which became the motto of the American Indian boarding school movement from the early 1900s until they were officially dismantled in the 1970s. That motto was kill the Indian and save the man. So between the 1890s and the 1970s, Indian students were forcibly removed from parents and sent to boarding schools. There they were beaten if they acted Indian. They were beaten if they spoke their own language. I had my father tell me himself when he was raised by his grandma and grandpa, because my grandmother was in a sanatorium when he was born. He said he remembers them speaking Indian, and he wanted to learn what they were saying, but they were unwilling to teach him. Many people had that story, and one reason why is because they were afraid that they would be overheard, and if they were speaking Indian, their children might be taken off to a boarding school. They were beaten if they spoke their own language. They were taught Christianity and the social decorum of the Anglo settlers. And as I said before, many of these students, unfortunately, did not return. So what is the result of the age of assimilation? We know the result of the age of annihilation. By 1890, the population of native people had declined to 250,000. Well, contrary to popular belief at the time, The superiority of the white man's way of life was neither accommodating nor irresistible to traditional native societies. And so we began where we'll pick up next week, the period from ashes to resurgence, and talk about the importance of reparative justice. Now, before we take a break, let me just say one thing. I gave you a warning. The second lecture is the hardest one. It's the hardest one to do, and it's the hardest one to hear, but let's lean into it. Let's lean into it, because when we encounter these uncomfortable truths, and when we are willing to rip off the Band-Aid, then we can have some sincere conversations about a theology of place. You say, what is a theology of place? Come back next week and I'll tell you.